creating ThinApp virtual applications. So what did you think of that last nugget? I mean, when you kind of focus on the user, all the different delivery approaches for how you end up getting an application and data to user, like it all just begins to make sense, right? So the application sits in some central location in various forms that make it easily deliverable via an installation tool or a sequencing tool or streaming tool, or and also that delivery can go to, for example, Windows servers in the case of server-based computing, or it can go to Windows desktops in the case of desktop virtualization. So hopefully that last nugget kind of gave you an idea that if you throw away if you throw all the technologies and replace those technologies with just the approaches, sometimes a lot of those complicated decisions begin to make more sense. In this nugget, we're going to move away more or less from the theoretical and go directly into the click here, then click here. And we're going to start by talking about how you go through that process of actually creating a ThinApp virtual application. The process it's not difficult, but nor is it really trivial at the same time. VMware, with its ThinApp product, and specifically with the sequencing tool that it uses to create these virtual apps, they've really tried to create a tool. You can tell the mind of the person that created these tools, because in many ways they've tried to create a tool that was very easily manipulable from the command line. You'll find that there aren't really many tools that let you manipulate things. Whenever you've got the application created, the way that you go about making changes to the application is you adjust some INI files in Notepad. So depending on if you're more of a command line person or if you're someone that likes to click things in an interface, this may or may not be something that's really exciting or useful to you. Now we have to obviously talk first about, okay, well, what are these virtual applications? I mean, we've talked about them in the generic sense or the very high level sense, but now we also have to kind of drill down into how do these things change the virtual machine experience when they get moved or when they get streamed down from a server. Now, a virtual app, and we'll find out here, and I've got a whole whiteboard here to show you in just a second, but a virtual application, the whole point of a virtual application is that it doesn't really change the operating environment of the machine or virtual machine that it's installed to. You can, depending on the settings that you choose when you build that virtual app, decide to actually impact the operating system. But the whole notion, the real point behind a virtual application is something that you can download and install, and you don't really change the whole way in which that virtual machine exists or what its configuration is. We also have to talk about this whole notion of, all right, well, if I've got these applications and they're all kind of these bubbles that exist on top of a virtual machine, well, how do we get the virtual applications to communicate with each other? And I'll discuss this here in just a minute. The technology in VMware View, or specifically in ThinApp, is called AppLink. And what AppLink does is essentially say, all right, well, for this application to work, it also needs to run this or be aware of this other application so that the applications can be sequenced independently, but you can bring them together in various combinations so that, for example, Microsoft Outlook can call Microsoft Word if you, for example, need to download an attachment and that attachment needs to run in Word. You will find that as we go through the tool that there are a series of really kind of 5 typical steps in creating a virtual application. And if you've done any application packaging before, these are the same kind of steps that you would go through in packaging an application. You scan a computer. Okay, you start with a kind of a very basic, pristine, golden image of a computer. You scan that computer, then you install the application, and then you rescan the computer a second time. In that second scan, what you're doing is looking for what changed between then and the first scan. It makes sense if you think about a software installation. At its very basic, a software installation is really nothing more than some file copies and then some registry updates. So this pre-scan, install, post-scan series of steps means that, okay, well, once that install completes and it's done all the things that it needs to, well, I just want to copy off and repackage together everything that is now different. Arguably, that is the application that got installed. Now, admittedly, when that whole process goes on, there's going to be just some stuff that gets inadvertently captured by that pre-scan and post-scan process, right? Maybe I don't know, maybe some other app file got adjusted, or maybe some other registry key got adjusted, or something else changed during that period of time that you need to either yank out or manipulate or what have you. This is after the post scan process, is the configure process, where you will go through and identify what you want to get rid of, and then build, as in the last step down here, the package. What's interesting about VMware ThinApp, if you've played with AppV, if you've played with Citrix Streaming Server, one of the interesting, kind of compelling things about VMware ThinApp is that there's no client to it. It really focuses on MSIs. And when you're building a ThinApp virtual application, you were effectively building this big MSI that you'd then install to a computer. And so it's strangely actually kind of cool the way that it ends up being implemented. Now, there are some things you have to pay because of the way in which this was implemented. Maybe it's not quite as easy to use as, for example, a Citrix app virtualization solution, because there's a client down there. And maybe there's no central control as much, but it's funny. It's really actually kind of cool, the fact that there is no client really, other than, well, the pieces that run MSI, that actually needs to be on that client or on that computer to let a ThinApp application work. Now, VMware will tell you that this whole ThinApp thing is not designed for anything outside of a virtual desktop environment. But if there's no client, well, arguably you can run it anywhere, right? So you could even use it. In fact, actually, the VMware View documentation even says, hey, you could use this in a sandbox to test things out. Then after we spend just a minute talking about, well, how virtual applications work, I want to spend another minute talking about how you create a ThinApp virtual application. Okay, the process is actually very cool. So before we get there, however, I just want to spend a little bit of time kind of drawing out this whole notion of a virtual application. Again, I'm using these stacked diagrams that you may find that I tend to use a lot. Let's think of this as a computer. Okay, and this computer is sitting on some hardware, or it's sitting on top of a hypervisor. I don't really care. It is a computer. And when I go to install an application, unlike MS Outlook, for example, when I install the app, well, that application installs on top of the operating system. Right? So I go and I do next finish to install Microsoft Outlook. Well, the thing that I think of as Outlook then installs on top of the thing that I think of as the computer OS instance. But really, there's not separation here. When I go and install MS Outlook, I change the configuration of that computer. I update things in program files. If it's a really bad app, it might even update things in the system folder. But the whole disk configuration of this computer gets changed because Outlook exists on there. In order to get rid of Outlook, I have to go and find all the places where Outlook has made changes and slowly tear them out if I want to get rid of this MS Outlook version. So that's how we've done software installations for years and years and years, because it just made sense. Well, some very intelligent people said, all right, the whole notion of a software installation that modifies the configuration of the operating system is in many ways kind of silly, right? How many times have you gone and installed some piece of software, and the installation of that piece of software accidentally corrupted the computer or made changes that overwrote things, or you have one piece of software that needs to use one Java runtime environment and another piece of software that needs to use a different Java runtime environment, but there can only be one, so how do you actually deal with that? So the notion of application virtualization, first and foremost, is we want to put a little kind of white space between the bubble that we think of as the application and the bubble that we think of as the computer. What's great about that is that once I have those identified bubbles in place, well, so Outlook can sit over here and Microsoft Word can sit over here. Now, from its position in that location, the idea is that Outlook can then leverage the resources down on that computer, right? I can use the file system in order to store files. Bad example, I can use the Windows files in order to drive running Microsoft Outlook. But again, the opposite, well, where the computer attempts to do things to the application, is generally not there. right? And again, I'm using kind of soft words here, so don't crucify me if I'm not specifically semantically correct here. I'm just trying to get across a point. And that is that Outlook, from its lofty position now on top of the operating system, has all of the nice resources that the computer can provide. And then at the same time, the computer kind of almost sort of kind of doesn't really have an awareness that Outlook or Microsoft Word exists. Meaning that if I needed to, I could just, delete Outlook or Microsoft Word. Poof, gone. Right? I delete the bubble and the bubble is gone. There's no having to go and dig into the computer to find out, okay, well, what changed there? When this gets created, okay, I've got a bubble here, right? And I've got a bubble here. When this gets created, the notion is that these things are bubbles, right? So if I have Outlook that needs to talk to, for example, Word, well, it can go down to the computer, but it can't really come back up to Microsoft Word. So for some circumstances, there sometimes comes the need to allow one bubble to communicate with another. Again, just very soft words here just to get the concept across. And so this cross-linking of applications is what we think of as AppLink, at least in the VMware View situation. And I can choose either to allow or to not allow that to occur. This is all up to you. You code this into your little application packages that you create so that they will have that ability to communicate, or they won't. Kind of interesting. Again, the whole goal here is to create that kind of air gap between the application and the software and the operating system that the application is running on top of. There will be ways, as you'll find out here in just a minute, that you can kind of violate that tenet because every rule has its exceptions, I guess. But that's kind of why we do this. Now, the way this process starts, okay, as you'll see here, I've got a Windows 7 computer. Okay, the computer that I'm about to use needs to be the same operating system as the one I'm going to deploy the application to, or very awful things happen. The world explodes. So I've got a copy of Windows 7, and from VMware's website, I have downloaded the VMware ThinApp Enterprise, and in this case it's 4.6.2. It may be slightly different when you see it. But this is the installation that you download. I've already gone through the install. There's absolutely nothing exciting to see in it. It's next finish. I think you put in a license key. And then what happens on this, again, very pristine copy of Windows, is I get VMware ThinApp Setup Capture. I want this to be a basic bare bones machine because I don't want there to be a whole bunch of extra stuff that's getting in the way that might corrupt the capture of what changed in this application. Okay, so this maybe should be as core bare bones as a machine as you can find. So now there's a couple of steps. In fact, there are 5. So I've got to get a baseline of the system. I've got to install that application. I then have to do another baseline and compare the changes, make some edits, configure the project settings, and then ultimately build that virtual application as an MSI. Now, I've also downloaded the application, very common open source application called 7-Zip. Right? People have been installing 7-Zip in places for a long time because 7-Zip is easy to get a hold of, and it allows you to zip up, stuffs for sending zip files. So, common application here that I want. It is not installed to this computer at this point. As you can see here, there's no 7-Zip installed here. I have the 32-bit version of 7-Zip too, by the way. And so this first step in this process is to click the next button and then the pre-scan button. Okay, so what's going on here? Right now, the ThinStall little agent thing is going through and taking a look at all the registry keys. In fact, you can see these registry keys here. It's creating a big database of those registry keys. And then it's also taking a look at all of the file stuff. So all the folder structure and what files and folders are there. Just the entirety of the configuration of the system, it's taking a look at that configuration. If there are a couple of locations that it can't find, it will give you a couple of warnings here. I don't care because I just know that 7-Zip does not modify this location. Once I'm done with the pre-scan, well, now the next step is to actually install the application. So you'll see here, install the application you want to virtualize before taking a post-scan. And in fact, what I'm going to do now is double-click 7-Zip and go through installing the 7-Zip application. Basic installation, right? Where's my destination folder? Install. Bam, done. Okay, so now 7-zip is actually found on this computer. There's the file manager here. And the second step is to go through the post scan. Now, at this point, this is, remember, what we are doing is we're looking for what is different. So you have some options here. Right? I can just click post scan now, and it will go through and change things. Or alternatively, I can just start going into 7-zip and maybe making some adjustments if I want to different settings. Oh, you know what? I want to make sure that it connects up with the zip extension or the .7z extension. And then also, let's see here, under, I don't know, what do I want to choose here? Settings. Let's do show the dot icon. I'm setting up this application in the way that I want it set up, because these settings get stored on this computer, right? So because they're stored on this computer, they're going to get captured by that post scan, all right? So okay, close that down, run the post scan. So as you can see here, once again, I'm going through this post scan, taking a look at the files and folders on this system, taking a look at the registry key values on this system. And so now I'm collecting a secondary database that I can then compare with the first database. Okay, that process is going to happen here next. Notice I choose next. And you'll see here that the post-scan process now goes through and compares the pre-scan with the post-scan. It's at this point that I have some decisions to make. Okay, so when I create this application, there has to be a way that you kind of get into the application, right? So the initial executable that executable fires other executables if it needs to. In Microsoft Word, for example, what is the initial executable for Microsoft Word? It's winword.exe, right? And winword may call other exes, but I don't really care, right? Because that's what winword calls. It's not for me to really be concerned about that. So here are a list of the potential executable files that could be called by this virtual application. File manager, help, 7z.exe, blah, 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 blah. I can go here to, for example, the location, view properties on that, to see that 7zfm.exe is that's the entry point. Okay, that's the executable that I want, which is right here, to actually launch the application. Okay, that's what's going to be made available in that package. So I'm going to choose 7zip-filemanager.exe or 7zfm.exe here as the entry point, and it'll take care of anything else that it needs. I just don't care. So I choose next. Which groups are going to be allowed to run this package? Do I want to link it to specific Active Directory groups or not? I'm not going to at this point. A little later on in the next nugget, we'll talk about how we can lock this down a little bit. So there's multiple locations where you can make the package available, and this is one of those locations. Next, here is what we call the file system isolation mode. So remember how I told you that the goal of application virtualization was to create this kind of air gap between an application and the operating system it runs on? Well, in some circumstances, you might actually want the application to actually modify the system. Not all the places in the system, but just some of those places that are safer, quote unquote, on that system because it just needs it to operate. This is the top item here we call merged isolation mode. What it does is it provides full write access to all of the non-critical directories, the non-system directories on whatever system this piece of software gets installed to. So it can actually read and write directly to that local machine. Okay, any changes here in application data, system, program file directories get stored in what's called the Sandbox. So if user is working with this application, an application makes some change to one of these special protected areas, well, that change isn't going to get stored on the computer, but instead in this sort of nebulous thing that we think of as a sandbox. Hold that thought and I'll show you more about what this means here in a minute. Or if I want to preserve that, so the air gap between the application and the virtual machine, I can choose restricted write access. So the application can't write to most directories. The ones it can are the desktop and the My Documents location, but anything else gets stored in the sandbox. Okay. By choosing restricted write access, there are some applications that may behave a little funny. but I get the most isolation between, well, my app and my operating system. Let's choose this one for now. Okay, choose next. So there is this nebulous sandbox thing, right? So it's it is a storage location for any of these writes that the application thinks are getting written to the system, but instead are getting under the covers redirected to a different location. This other location is that sandbox. So the application thinks it's writing to the system, but in fact it's writing to this special little location that can exist either in the user profile or in the same directory as the application or in a custom location or network drive. I'll choose user profile here. Different applications will require different settings here for the sandbox, and it will be, there's an art and a science to this, and this is really the art. Right? Your testing and validation of your individual pieces of software will be what determines what works best for you. So I can't teach you that. You have to kind of just figure it out. And it may be different for each application. So in this user profile, then I know that, well, the profile or the sandbox data then gets captured with the user and may potentially follow the user around. Right? If I've got, and that depends on if I've got profile, you know, I don't want to say roaming profiles, but if I've got some sort of profile management solution that allows user profiles to get moved around. That's this location. Choose next. Do I want to send stuff to VMware? Yes. No, I don't care. Then what are the project settings? So here's the name. Here is the project location. This location here is actually found on a local computer. Okay, so if I go to that location, you'll find there's nothing there right now. This is the ThinApp binaries, and then this is the captures folder. I'll leave this open for us because we're going to take a look at it here in just a second. We're going to create a subfolder 7-zip 9.2, choose next. And then now I have to identify where I'm going to hold that virtual application's data. Okay, do I want to keep it in the exe? Okay, that's the exe that I selected earlier. Do I want to use a separate DAT file? Okay, where do I want to hold all this stuff at? Because this is going to be important for when I actually generate that MSI. I need to actually generate an MSI here. Okay, that's the ultimate deliverable is the MSI, right? When I go to link this to my virtual desktops, I'm going to link it by that MSI. And then lastly, do I want to compress the package? Okay, it depends on if you want to increase the build time or not. Okay, what's better for you, storage or waiting a few extra minutes? Choose save. It's going to save those project files. It's generating output to that location. And then now, actually, after I let it do its thing, you'll see that I have this 7-zip 9.2 location here that is slowly getting populated with additional stuff. Notice some of the wildcards here. Right, so these should be ones that are, you should be familiar with these. Right? Every computer has a desktop. Every computer has a drive C. On that desktop are going to be some attributes, right? Some configuration settings for that location. In the app data location are going to be some additional stuff. So these are the things that are getting added into the computer. Let's see if I can find one that's got some actual stuff in there. Here's 7-zip. Here's the actual actual files that are going to get stored in that location. If I take a look at the attributes, again, I'm trying to find one that actually has one here so you can see it. I can see what the attributes are for that file or folder. Also down here are text documents that relate to current user, local machine, HK users. So this document is actually, or excuse me, this installation is actually manipulating HK local machine. And here are the instructions that are necessary in order to do that. Okay, very important you have the spaces here between them. Okay, same thing with current user. When I'm done with this, okay, you'll notice that, all right, we're ready to build the package. Okay, we've done all of the stuff. We now know what's different between here and there. You probably at this point should have gone through these, individual registry keys to make sure that nothing stupid is in there. That there's not anything that actually relates to something else, right? Maybe while we were going on, or between the first snap and the second snap, oh, check it out. Explorer had a registry key value that doesn't really look like it belongs to a 7-zip installation. Maybe I can go and delete that, for example. So there is some guess and check work in here to make sure that what is about to go on makes sense for that package. And this is, again, this is all part of that whole art in packaging that you'll have to take a look at. If this seems complex to you, don't worry. It takes a couple of applications to get packaged before you really kind of get your feel for it. And I'll tell you, having just a really good familiarity and comfort with the registry and where things should be placed in the registry will help you identify that, well, these all look right, but I don't know, that this top one here maybe doesn't look right. Anyway. All right, so we'll close this down. I don't want to save it. So this is all the stuff that's going to change as part of that installation. There's also down here a file called package.ini. And this file corresponds to the edit package.ini link here. If I click that, that's going to open up package.ini, or I could just double-click the file itself. Inside of this file are the characteristics for the package installation. Okay, this is the stuff that ThinApp does. And built into here are going to be a number of different settings that you may or may not want to change. Okay, if I take a look here, what's my compression type? What have I done? Which isolation mode am I using? What MSI parameters are in there? Notice that some of them may actually be commented out. Do I also have other characteristics that I want to bring in here? Here's some general purpose parameters. Down here at the bottom is optional app links and required app links. Now I told you that sometimes different packages need to link to each other. The linking actually happens at runtime. So when the user starts working with the application, that's when all of these bundles kind of get connected in the right way. All the integrations end up happening. And it's via these two locations, these app links location, where this 7-zip app could get linked with some other app. Okay, and that's kind of going beyond the scope of the level of detail that I really can get into with this nugget. But recognize that as you start working with your different applications and packaging them for use in ThinApp, or sequencing them, depending on what term you like to use, this is the location where you will take this app and link it with other apps. And in fact, you can actually do multi-level linking too. So this app links with this one, and then the second app, it links with something downstream. A lot of flexibility here. And strange, in a world where INI files have gone away, it's almost refreshing to see INI files once again. I really like these more than XML files, although XML seems to be the way we're going these days. If you do intend on, there's one of these settings that you have to be very specific about. If you do intend on streaming this application to view desktops, there's one property in here that you have to actually change. And it's MSI streaming is the property. So I gotta go find it first. It is further up. There it is. So MSI streaming is normally set to 0 by default. Okay, if I'm gonna stream this to view desktops, then I need to change that to a 1. Okay, so just be aware of that. That's up here under MSI parameters near the top of the file. Save the file. Okay, click the build button. And as you can see, we're actually going about building that application. So, all right, where are we at? Here in the application now, in the bin folder, is now the Windows installer file, 7-zip 9.20, that I can now deploy out to, well, all my virtual machines. So I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to save that for the next nugget because there's some things you have to think about whenever you're doing that. But really, this is now the bin file that we have generated using this tool. Pretty cool, huh? I click Finish, and I'm not going to open the folder since I've already got the folder open, and I'm done. So this is the process you would go through to actually create that application, that virtual application. There's one thing, too, I need to show you. If I go back here into the capture location, so remember, the idea here is that whatever you see is what's going to happen. And if there's something that shows up in here that you don't want to see, in the all users location or whatever, and you're like, ooh, I don't really want that, so I'm going to delete it out. I've got to make a change. Or if I come down here to my package.ini and I make a change in here, well, conveniently, VMware has this nice little build tool here that's a batch file. Get that in a world of XML. We are now at INI and batch. Great job, VMware. This batch file, it works, okay? It works. This batch file then goes about rebuilding that MSI. Okay, so when you made your changes, you go double click this thing, and then bam, it's going to go back and rebuild that MSI for you. Okay, the MSI then is here under bin. So that's kind of the process you would go through for really doing one of these ThinApp virtual applications, sort of the build process. And admittedly, there are different solutions use different approaches. Like Citrix's solution has a GUI interface for doing a lot of this manipulation. AppV has something different. It's funny because it's very clean. It's very kind of slick, actually, in the way that VMware has put this together with easy to think of INI files and batch files. So, kind of old school, but at the same time, it works. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We have talked about creating ThinApp virtual applications. We started with a look at how those virtual applications are different than traditionally installed applications, and really that it's that air gap that we really need to be conscious of. We talked about app linking and how, because I'm creating these bubbles, the different bubbles have to be able to communicate with each other. And then we went through the typical steps in creating a virtual application, the pre-scan, we installed that 7-zip tool, we went through a post-scan, we did some post-scan configuration, and then we built that MSI. And then down here at the bottom, I showed you the magic of how it all works. In the next nugget, we will take that ThinApp virtual application, that 7-zip app, and we will roll it into our VMware View infrastructure so that we can deploy that application to our virtual machines. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.